Greetings, everyone. It's so nice to see so many faces online and in person. I should correct a little thing about my bio, which is the last two books that were mentioned. I didn't edit them, I contributed to them. Other people edited them. So just to clarify that, I want to begin by telling you a little story. I want to take you back approximately 13.8 billion years ago. This date is actually slightly disputed, but let's say it's close enough for now. Approximately 13.8 billion years ago, there was a Big Bang, it is said, that brought the universe into being. It's funny, when I was looking up this number, it said that was the moment the universe came into being. And I thought that's a little odd and ambiguous because as far as we know, before the universe came into being, there were no moments because there was no time. But anyway, time, that moment was all created at once. Nobody really knows how it happened. But then we count back from there, 13.8 billion years. Approximately 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth forms out of stardust and star goop that's floating around the universe, coalesces and makes planet Earth. About 3.5 billion years ago, life begins to form, single-celled life. Single-celled creatures dominate for a long time, 530 million years ago. Now we're into millions. Finally, we have some vertebrates. About 500 million years ago, some of them start to come out and wander around the land. 200 million years ago, dinosaurs. 180 million years ago or so, mammals. 75 million, the first primate ancestors. 2.8 million, the first members of our species, of our genus Homo, so the first hominids, and about 315,000 to 200,000 years ago, the first Homo sapiens, the first hominids like us. And then I'm going to fast forward to the year 1956 AD, in which there's a little bang. My father and mother come together, donate sperm and egg to create another single-celled organism at first, which finally in 1957 comes into the world. Let's fast forward a couple more years for that young being to develop a sense of selfhood and a little bit of a basic vocabulary. And all of a sudden, somewhere around 1959, all of a sudden I go, "Here I am, world! It's me!" So I bring this up as a way of entering the subject of no self or non-self or not self, which we hear a lot about in Buddhism. It can seem like a kind of esoteric and remote thing that perhaps we'll experience one day when we're fully enlightened. I would like to bring us into recognizing that it's actually something that any of us who have practiced for some time and who practice with some depth have probably experienced at least the entry level to know self from certain angles. So, like many things in Zen, I like to kind of demystify some of it and help us to realize that some of these principles are closer than we realize. So, by just telling that little story, I hope to demonstrate the absurdity of me saying all of a sudden in 1959, here I am, I'm an independent being, I've got will, watch out world, I'm coming, right? You know, there's, before I come into being, or any of us, there's, more than 13 billion years of cause and effect that lead up to me. And yet somehow After a while, after birth, it takes a little while, but as I start to develop this sense of self, we're going to look at what exists before we develop that, because something exists. But we develop this sense of self, and then somehow we think we're independent creatures. And as we mature through into adulthood, we begin to feel, in some ways, fundamentally separate, fundamentally individual, rather than fundamentally a part of the universe. And that fundamental sense of me against the universe kind of leads to all sorts of feelings of loneliness, alienation, threat, fear, anxiety, right? Because we feel at risk. Of course, and at one level we are. But to bring myself into being to where I can make the choice to show up a little before 5:30 to sit with you all, I could make simple choices like that. There's an awful lot of building up of selfhood that leads me to the point where I feel like like I have a good modicum of free will and etc. And this is, it's fundamentally a delusion, as Buddhism tells us often, that this notion that we're fundamentally separate. So I want to try and deconstruct that, take it apart a little bit for us. I've spent a lot of time wondering why we think we're fundamentally separate, and I think a lot of it comes down to portability. We're portable. We can move around in the universe. Therefore, we think, hey, I'm doing, I can move over there. I can move over there. I have some sort of modicum of being able to make choices. It seems to me like I'm, free, a free and independent individual. But just to challenge this sense of our fundamental individuality or separation, I would challenge you to try and remove yourself from the universe. Isn't that funny? It can't be done. Well, I guess we can quibble with that because some people take their own lives, but they sure leave a mess behind, which is still in the universe and is going to convert into other things in the universe, right? Science tells us nothing is really lost. We don't really know what the consciousness part of us, what happens to that or where it goes. But I suspect, just like any form of energy or being, it can't really be lost from the universe. It transforms into something else. I'm not going to speculate what that is because I don't know, so don't ask me. But we've all tried to remove ourselves from the universe, right? We've all had that moment where we threw ourselves down on our bed and said, take me now, this sucks, right? This is awful, take me, right? And it doesn't happen. That's not within our will to remove ourselves from this environment, right? I don't think I have to go into all of the parameters of that. If in person, sometimes I say, okay, everyone try jumping in the air, if I really want to mess up that's, sedentary part of sitting in the Zendo. So for a moment, perhaps we're free from touching the earth, but we're still bound by gravity. We're going to come back down. We've still got air molecules around us. We're still breathing. We still have to take in nourishment. We still have to excrete it out, okay? So the universe is always passing through us, and we are largely at its mercy in terms of our aging and many other aspects. So this thing of no self, it can be seen from many different, it's sometimes compared to seeing the certain aspects of Zen practice is sometimes compared to like facets of a jewel. We keep turning the jewel and looking in from another angle, right? So this is a simple angle I'm presenting. I'm sure we all kind of grasp this angle, but just, we got to start somewhere. Of course, lots of human beings don't really accept that we're fundamentally embedded in the universe. In fact, I would say we're a lot more part of the universe than we are independent. Independent of the universe is this tiny thing that happens for less than a century among all those billions of years, right? All the rest of the time, all our molecules and everything are just going into everything else, right? They've all gone back to the universe. But our whole ecological crisis right now has to do with human beings feeling that we're separate, that we can use our environment. We all know this, right? But just to kind of start with basics, anybody who has a sense of ecological interdependence understands to some degree no self or not self, this Buddhist principle. That's largely cognitive, although it's not just cognitive, because if we feel it in our hearts, it's not just cognitive, right? I wonder how many of us feel some pain over what's happening with the earth. Okay, so that's not just cognitive, it's in our hearts, it's in our guts. And in the time I've been teaching university, which is about 27 years, I have seen the mental and emotional state of the average student who comes into my class has greatly declined. It's at the point now where I'm about to start teaching my university class meditation for credit next week for the new semester. And one of the questions I always ask the class is, how many of you experience anxiety or depression or stress to the point where it's every day or nearly every day, at least one of those factors, and it really cramps the quality of your life, it really impacts the quality of your life. 27 years ago, everybody didn't raise their hand. Now everybody raises their hand, at least the honest ones do. And UNM Taos is a pretty open university, and I get the people in the holistic program. So they're mostly open and honest. They mostly just go, yeah, that's me, right? So I'm pretty confident that a lot of this kind of, especially anxiety that people feel, like free-floating anxiety that seems to come from nowhere, comes from the fact that the Earth's out of balance and we're going through a great extinction. And, everything that's happening with our society and culture and all that. There's this, we all know we're not really separate, and there's this groundswell of anxious stuff. It's going to pop up in our being in some way. So I think we're being affected by it all the time. But I'd like to go kind of into a deeper, different level, which is also something we've all experienced, of this no self or not self. And I'd like to, let's see, am I host? Who's in charge here? Is somebody, if I want to ask questions, which I do want to momentarily, will I be able to choose people to raise hands, or is that someone else's job?
Yeah, I think Kieran can help us out with that, or I can simply look at the screen. So
okay, well, I can too, and I can handle it. I just want to be sure I have the power. As an individual, freestanding entity who has absolute power over my destiny, I'd like to be able to have some power over yours to at least unmute you. Yeah. Okay, we'll figure it out. What I want to do is take us a moment to double back to where I was in 1957 and where we all were at some point. Is there anybody here who has not given birth or been birthed? Raise your hand. Okay, we've all been through it, right? So at some point, of course, most of us don't remember it consciously. Some people claim to, I don't know. But we can certainly cast our imagination back there. So let's not say the first moment we come out of the womb. Let's give us a day or two to acclimatize. But say on day 2 or day 3, when we've kind of settled down, here we are in the world. I wonder, let's just take a moment and see if we can cast our minds back there because we were all there, we've all known this, and ask ourselves how the world would have appeared to us. What would we have been aware of or conscious of? What would our experience have been in those first few days? It's really the first months of infancy. Some of us have studied this and we know something about this, but can we just kind of take our minds back there? I do want to ask for feedback here. What do you suppose our experience would have been like in those first few days, weeks, months? Anybody? Anybody want to speculate or remember or imagine?
Hi, I'm imagining that it was very sensuous, that we were aware of smells and touch and sounds.
Right, all our senses would have been functioning, right? It's, perhaps they were not functioning at their fullest level, but yeah, we would have been able to see, hear, taste, touch, smell. Yeah. One thing I wonder, though, is we wouldn't have known the names for those things. And we wouldn't have, would we have been able to distinguish between the senses? I don't know for sure, but I wonder. Or would it have just been a sensory onslaught? What do you think? Would we have known that sound was one kind of realm of experience and sight was another, or would it have all just been coming in? You know?
Well, I happen to have a new baby, grandson.
Oh, good.
And I've had the privilege of watching 5 of them, and this is number 5, and he's now
Oh, great.
9 months. But I watched him in infancy, each of them, and it's quite profound. It's like this openness, like not knowing, and just presence.
Yeah.
Like a real presence. And yet there's a sensitivity to sound, like they don't know sound, but they have like fear can get triggered.
Yeah, they'll react to it, sure.
They react to it. But I think like emptiness, right? Or not knowing is really what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's very true. We wouldn't know anything in the conventional way yet, would we?
Just like they're just
Go ahead. Yeah.
present, just really present, like really like
Completely present. It would have to be present moment because we don't know past or future yet, right? That's all conceptualized. We don't have memory yet. We can't project into the future yet. Yeah. Yeah. And but the thing I want to point out is, nevertheless, there's an individual there. Your fifth grand kid is not there. The kid is not real, and the kid is not somebody else. The kid is an individual being, but there's no notion of separation. There's no notion of nothing, right?
No, and I had this direct experience really with all of them, but
Yeah.
with this last one. And the first one, I was in the hospital right after she was born, and I was holding her, and she looked in my eyes, and I looked in her eyes, and it was like, wow, like our beings connected. And I experienced it with this little guy. And I might not see him for a week, but as soon as he sees me, there's this wonderful connection.
There's no self-protection there because there's no sense of self. There's nothing, we don't know that there's anything to protect, right?
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. So there's this direct intimacy. The way science, I'm sure we've all heard this, the way science describes it is we're one with our environment. We don't know the difference between us and our environment. And we don't know the difference between us and our mother, for one thing. And yet, could you say we know unity?
I think so.
Anyone?
What's that?
Oh, I can't see you all.
With the unity.
Let's see, I can't see everyone on screen. Let me see if I can get to where I can. In case someone raises their hand. Chris Maston, did you raise your hand? Yeah.
I didn't, but
You scratch your nose?
maybe.
Okay.
I don't know. My first thought was chaos, like not being able to discriminate between the senses and just sort of being bombarded. And I don't know how accurate vision and hearing and taste, at least vision, is when you're that young. So I think I was sort of imagining just like everything happening.
I would imagine it would be like that, yeah. And gradually start to separate things out from the chaos, right?
Yeah.
One of the lovely things you see about kids is they'll do this, their arm will be waving around, right? But they don't know it's their arm, and they don't know they're doing it, and they don't know how to do it. In fact, to this day, I don't know how to raise my arm. Can anybody, if I couldn't raise my arm, could you explain to me how to do it? No. Isn't it remarkable? Somehow they figure out that I'm going to call this part of me eventually, and I can do things with it. But they sure don't know that at first. They're like, oh, what's this thing, right? They'll be flailing around. The reason I'm bringing this up is what part of us is essentially individual as we're going to be, and how much of it is built up in the mind and created in the mind. That's what I'm looking at here. And so this question of yeah, you could say we're unified with the environment. We're one with our environment. But do we know we're one with the environment? We don't know. We don't know separation. We don't know unity. We don't know nothing, right? It's all just, it's coming in. I mean, we're conjecturing here, but it's pretty well known. Where do you suppose the first separation begins? Anyone? The first sense of kind of concrete separation, really concrete separation, might be happening. The woman who spoke first, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, about your 9-month-old grandchild, might be happening right around then, not far from then. What do you think?
I think as soon as the umbilical cord is cut.
I couldn't hear that. Could you repeat?
You can say it. You can say it.
She said that she believed it was as soon as the umbilical cord was cut.
Separation physically begins, but I'm talking about when do we start to know or start to see ourselves as separate? I'm not even going to say no, because we're not. I think if there's anything my 13.8 billion years compressed story illustrates is we can't possibly be separate. We came from 13.8 billion years of stuff, but, and it's true that is an important moment when the umbilical cord's cut, but we don't yet know the umbilical cord has been cut or that we had an umbilical cord, or, when do we first start to think, I'm me and I'm not anything else? What do you think?
Well, one thing would be when you want the nipple and it's not there.
Well, when you want the nipple and it's not there, yeah. I mean, at first, you're probably just going to react to that, right? You're hungry, nothing's feeding you, you're going to cry, right? How about, what's the first word most kids say? And about what time?
Mama?
Yeah, some version of mom, mama, right? So once you're labeling something as mama or ma, it's not you anymore, right? That's, I believe we can point to language being the first conceptualization, the first notion that mama isn't me and I'm not mama. And if she's not around, I'm not going to get that nipple, but we're not thinking that far yet. But pretty quickly we start breaking the universe into mama, me, then pretty soon it's me and papa and cat and dog and all that, right? So what happens in Zazen when we let go of thought? Are we experiencing something we've never known? We're not experiencing something we've never known. the mind empty of thought is the way we were born, right? Just we're in awareness, but there's no conceptualization happening, right? So, which is not to say that infants are enlightened. They're not. They exist in a state of innocence. But we have fallen out of the self story that we learned through language, through conceptualization. Nothing wrong with this. We had to do it, right? Babies can't survive on their own. They don't even know they can't survive on their own. They have to learn they can't survive on their own. We have to learn so many things in order to ensure our survival, But there's this wonderful TED Talk I would encourage you all to see. It's by a I forget exactly what she is, some sort of neuroscience researcher named Jill Bolte Taylor, who had a stroke. The TED Talk's called My Stroke of Insight, and she wrote a wonderful book called My Stroke of Insight. She had a stroke that she was able to observe from the inside. She knew what was happening because she was a brain scientist. But the upshot of it was it wiped out her left hemisphere completely for a time. And it catapulted her entirely into the nonverbal realm. She had no words for a time, no concepts for a time. And it catapulted her into a state of what she called nirvana or enlightenment, a complete sense of unity. And despite the fact that she was in pain and struggling a lot, this sense of immersion and resultant, she describes it as she knew enough. She didn't know much about Buddhism, but she knew enough about it to be able to call this nirvana, what she experienced, right? She felt completely her continuity with the entire universe, simply because, this is what's interesting about it to practitioners, simply because her verbal conceptual hemisphere was turned off for a time, right? Of course, she worked hard to get her verbal conceptual hemisphere back. It took some years, and she eventually did. But what started to happen when her left hemisphere started to come online, she started to realize that a lot of certain aspects, the more defensive aspects of her personality were coming back online too. They were all associated with that conceptual side, with the concept of being separate. She did not feel the need for such defenses when she was just in her right brain. When the left brain started to come back on, she realized that she didn't want certain aspects of her selfhood back. And what's fascinating for those of us who practice is there was no Buddhist concept associated with it. She was experiencing this kind of on the ground. Here comes back conceptualization. Here comes back words. Well, I want them back because I want to function. However, there's a notion of self there that's quite defended, and I don't want it back. And so certain aspects, what she describes as like defensiveness, a sense of superiority, what do you call it when you, condescension, impatience with people who weren't as well educated or who she saw wasn't as smart, a sense of who's better, who's worse, mostly her being better. All this stuff started to come back online and she could see it. And she started working, just like we do in Zazen, with letting go of certain of those categories of thoughts and not reinforcing them. And so she developed a practice kind of all her own around this. One of the things she comes up with, which I don't know that I've ever heard stated so completely, but she ends up concluding from this very discerning mind of the brain scientist, she ends up concluding that the basic purpose of the internal monologue, which we all work with in Zazen, right, is to reinforce the sense of self, to reinforce the sense of who we think we are, right? Mm. In Zazen, if Zazen is successful, even for moments, we're dropping that self-story, right? I want to point this up because any of us who practiced for a time, especially if we've done retreat practice or we practice deeply, I'm sure we've experienced those moments where We've dropped in between thinking, usually happens on retreat, but we have a space where nothing's happening. And isn't it nice? Isn't it lovely? You ever hit that space and think, oh, this is the thing, this is Zazen. Of course, then once you start thinking this is the thing, this is Zazen, you start thinking again, you ruin it. But, after a while, you learn not to wreck it, right? With self-consciousness. And you're able to know that it's there, but there's this, I heard the Zen teacher, used to be a beat poet, Philip Whalen, once say, do the simple practice for a while and all your problems will go away. And that really struck me. It's not entirely true, but to a certain extent it is. When we're in those moments, we don't have any problems, right? We're just in the present moment. We're just in fact, it happens not only during Zazen, but it happens at other times. For a lot of us, it's happening now. We're not sitting there thinking, oh, since Chris spoke before, how do you say your last name, Chris? Is it Maston? Am I saying it right? Yeah, so she's not sitting there thinking to herself, oh yeah, I'm Chris Maston, here I am, I live at so-and-so place, I've done so-and-so in my life, I'm so-and-so a certain age, I'm so-and-so a certain state of health. We have this illusion of continuity of the self-story, isn't it funny? And yet if we look at it, it's not very continuous. It's actually kind of a false narrative. If some of you must have been here when I did the talk on the 5 conditions, that version of the 5 skandhas that I got from Bernie Glassman, which is kind of a simplified, updated version for the kind of minds we have in the 20th and 21st century. It's a very usable, I use it with my university students all the time. It's a very usable, simple set of, I want to say concepts, but concepts as concepts, it's not very useful. As practice, it's very useful to distinguish between our direct experience of reality and what we think about it, what our mind adds to it, and stories that our mind adds to it. In fact, it would be fun to talk more about that more one of these days, because it really clarifies that difference for us. But I wonder how many people really love going to cocktail parties. Anyone? I'm not raising my hand. I'm just demonstrating. Anyone out there love going to? Why do we, in general, not like going to cocktail parties? Because we're going to trot out this false narrative of who we're supposed to be, right? This is what I do. This is where I live. This is my stat. All this stuff, right? How many people know what I mean? Like you find yourself in these situations. It's not always a cocktail party, but and you feel like what you're trotting out just isn't real. Of course, that's why we're all here and doing Zazen, right? So, but what I want to say and what I want to point out, and if we let it register, it might just sink in more deeply when the self-narrative has dropped in sitting or at other times in life, then it stops reinforcing itself. We definitely have at least a foot in what no self means, or non-self. There are myriad subtle ways in which we can have a deeper experience of that, or another experience from another facet. But perhaps in a later talk we can go into some of those. But for tonight, what I really want to point out is this is not something esoteric and distant. We experience it already. It's very helpful to notice in that non-self-conscious, non-noticing, not knowing way that this is something we actually experience, that this is something we actually know. Not only do we know it, it's a certain reclaiming of something we once knew before we knew anything, when we were infants. It's not a completely unfamiliar thing. It's not like some distant thing. It also doesn't mean, just because a baby doesn't know who the baby is, does the baby vanish? No. Sometimes we think, oh, this no self thing, I'm going to completely vanish. Well, my experience is you don't completely vanish. what happens is when the borders of self fall away, which largely mean defensive structures, when the borders of the self fall away, then everything we experience, there's a continuity of self that goes beyond this, the skin bag, as it's sometimes called, because our minds are continually. One of my mottos in presenting this is all phenomena are created equal. This is another thing we can notice in Zazen. Things rise, things fall, things rise, things fall. Sometimes things fall away, other sensations come in. But the thing to notice is that the mind is subconsciously always parsing out which of these things are me and which aren't, So now that I'm an adult, some part of my mind is seeing this hand in front of me, and it's just parsing out, this is important, this is part of me, But this computer in front of me that I'm talking to, that's not part of me, But actually, if you go to basics in Zazen, actually, there's just sensation again, right? It's just sensation. We're not divvying it up. And we're not weighing, not only are we divvying up the universe in such a way that I'm parsing out that this is my hand, but there's another subtle thing happening, which is, isn't this a cool hand? Or isn't this a lousy hand, right? We're divvying up and judging what we're experiencing, right? I want to get to a little bit of discussion to hear more from some of you, but like so many things, when we start talking about no self, it doesn't mean we're not real or we're not here any more than it means the universe isn't real or isn't here. The other branches of the Eastern tradition, like in Hinduism, they're a lot more inclined to seeing existence as purely a dream. The Tibetans seem to lean in that direction too. We certainly don't view things that way in the Zen tradition. The Zen tradition, Mahayana tradition, is more like you can't say it's real, you can't say it's not real. You can't say when we say sometimes we describe our individuality as saying not two. It's not exactly oneness, but it's not exactly separateness. It's not. Our dualistic mind wants to say it's one or the other. Not exact. Once you start saying the universe isn't real, then you can justify all sorts of stuff because it doesn't matter, right? That's not the way we really see things in the Zen tradition. We see the unreality of it comes with the way we see it. We don't see it clearly. We see distinctions, say, between self and other that aren't exactly there in the way we see them. We see me as a freestanding individual in a way that's conceptualized that makes me feel quite separate when actually I'm not all that separate. It's actually really nice to not feel ourselves so separate, to feel ourselves more in continuity with our environment. Where do I want to go with this? I might have mentioned in a prior talk here that there was this research done in the 1950s, I think it was sometime, when cataract surgery became portable. There were these teams of doctors that went all over the country and gave thousands of people with congenital cataracts the gift of sight. They aged from infants to people in their 80s and everywhere in between. And if you want to know more about this, the best discussion of it I've seen is in Annie Dillard's book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Chapter 2 is about seeing. And she's kind of parsing out this research for us, because there is a book by those scientists, but she's kind of pulling out specifics from it that really connect to the spiritual ground that we're working with, in, for want of a better word, in Zen. But newly sighted people, when the bandages are taken off, first of all, the world is overwhelming. You know, they've had the other senses functioning, but they did not realize the visual world was so big and so full. But newly sighted people don't see depth. Now, if you look around where you're sitting, I think I see depth. I think I see that it's a certain distance to the door. It's a certain, there's certain things over here and over there, and they're all set out in space. Newly sighted people don't see space. They don't see depth. It's an imposition of the mind. Newly sighted people can immediately learn to identify color and shape. Those are the two aspects of sight that are instant. They could, give them 5 minutes, somebody points out the colors and shapes to them, they can see it. But the way they see the world is not as a collection of objects separated at their edges and placed in space. They see the world as a flat field of a two-dimensional field of objects all joined at the edges, shapes and colors all joined at the edges, like a quilt. That's the way they see the world. Now, just that little thing, imagine how different it would be to see the world that way. Everything's joined at the edges. I don't even question that I see the edge of this hand and think it's separate from the room. But that's not the way they see it. That's not the way we would have seen it at first either. We would have seen it exactly that same way. We don't have time to go into all the stories, but some people were so overwhelmed by having to deal with the visual world that there was a story of it that some of them said they were going to refuse the gift of sight. I don't know how many stuck with that, but there's a story of a teenage girl who struck a deal with her parents that she had to keep her eyes open at school, but when she came back home after school, she was allowed to close her eyes and return to the comfortable, small world of the blind. Many people, ever after having sight return to them, always had to close their eyes going upstairs because they knew how to feel it, but the visual just confused them. They'd trip. There was a story of a man who taught himself to see depth by reaching under his bed every morning. He'd grab his boot, he'd toss it into the middle of the room, and he'd take a step and see if he could reach it. Couldn't reach it. Take another step, see if he could reach it. Couldn't reach it. Took another step. See, it took him months, apparently, to learn what we would know automatically exactly how many steps it would take to reach and pick up the boot, right? So isn't it funny that even our sensory information, before it's conditioned and before it's interpreted by the mind, would not have given the world to us as a collection of separate objects in the same way we tend to see it, right? Anyway, chapter 2, I think it's chapter 2 in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, wonderful book about unity consciousness and from a million different angles by a very smart philosophical mind who I don't think she knew much about Buddhism at the time. Again, I'm always fascinated when somebody discovers these things kind of intuitively or through direct experience. Just one more thing I want to say, and then I'd like to hear a little bit from some of you. We use this term ego a lot in spiritual. I'm not so fond of that word. But anyway, in practices we call spiritual, we use the term ego. But really, it's not a very good translation because it's a term that has only existed for, I don't know, Freud started using it. I think it existed before then, but he kind of formulated an idea of ego. That's not even the idea of ego we tend to have now. And to make a direct translation of ego from no self is, to a certain extent, an imposition on the original experience and notion, what has been tried to communicate to us over the years through Buddhism about the self and the nature of the self. However, we could, for our purposes, we certainly use that aspect of self that's called the ego. And just to say, the way it appears to me is the ego is largely that idea of self, the self story that we build up. And then as we start to build it up, we create a system of defenses around it, right? And we see these defenses, we can see these defenses when we take something personally, when we take offense, when we become embarrassed, when we become self-conscious, when we find ourselves stubbornly clinging to an opinion that we don't even care about. These are all times we're stuck in the ego defenses. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it. I don't think any of us would be practicing if we hadn't come into adulthood with healthy egos. You need to build up that, and then you start to realize, oh, this isn't the whole deal. And it starts to feel maybe a little bit entrapping. But we've probably all noticed there's a number. We're not really like one self inside. There's a whole committee in there, isn't there? There's all these different voices, and some of them conflict. Some of you may have done that kind of work, internal family systems or voice dialogue. The ego to me seems to be the way I define it is a kind of a subcommittee among the larger committee of several different voices, and particularly voices that find it necessary to set these boundaries and defend the sense of self, which then becomes confining, right? So I have to leave the rest for another conversation, but I'd love to hear a little bit. Anybody have comments, questions, complaints, objections? Defenses? Does anybody just want to comment on this? I would encourage you, realization comes from investigation. So if anyone will get calm from sitting, but the inquisitive mind, the mind of inquiry, which is stimulated automatically through koan practice, is what leads to us realizing and discovering and having insight. Not in a grasping way, but in the way we look out the window when we're traveling through a new country and we're really interested in the scenery and we're wondering about it, that kind of wondering. So to wonder about what is this? What is this no self? And what did Sean say? And was he right? Maybe he's wrong. Maybe part of it's right. We're not going to be able to pin it down perfectly. So you're allowed to investigate it on your own. And when you're not sitting, to give it some thought, and then test out whatever you discover in your sitting. So, anyway, anyone got anything they'd like to say, ask, add?
I'm just wondering if you could repeat the TED Talk and the book and author at the end.
Yes, Jill Bolte Taylor. The TED Talk, amazingly, in about 22 minutes, gives you the capsule summary, and it's great to see her. But if that speaks to you, I'd go pick up the book. You have to put up with a little bit of brain technicality in one of the couple early chapters. You probably could skip through part of that. It's the real scientific stuff and get to the deeper part. But yeah, it's fascinating stuff, and it really makes one think about, really? I'd never thought about it exactly that way, that the inner, I've often wondered why we have this inner monologue going all the time, and she just very baldly says, I think it's telling us who we are again and again and again and again. And you know what? It's something clicked for me when I heard her say that. It's like, you know what? I bet she's right. And maybe this is why Zazen helps, because it shuts up those voices a little bit, if we're lucky. Yeah. Jill Bolte Taylor, I recommend it. And Annie Dillard was the other book I really recommend.
My stroke of love.
Mm-hmm.
My stroke of insight.
If somebody asked a particular question, I couldn't hear it. Sorry.
What's the exact title of the book?
My Stroke of Insight. The other one is Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. My Stroke of Insight is the one about the Jill Bolte Taylor stroke. I believe the TED Talk is called that too. Certainly it'll come up if you search on it. It's only about 22 minutes or something. Very illuminating. Yeah. Anyone else have anything to share or ask? or add. We're able here to only, yeah, I see a hand raised, okay?
I can talk.
No, let's get that. So I think they can hear better.
We're only able to scratch the surface here, but this is a couple ways into thinking. We think about it, but then we go into direct experience, okay? It's okay to think about it. When we're doing Zazen, perhaps the thought leads us to the edge of an experience to investigate. That's how it's worked for me and many people. Yes.
I just wanted to say I like the word committee that you use.
Yeah.
And all the different voices. And I think Mary Oliver, it was Barbara Kingsolver, has a poem about, it was a wild night and there was all these voices telling her what she had to do and what needed to do, but she had to save the one life that she could save.
Right, that's a great poem. Yeah.
There's that one voice saying, "Mend my life," and she just had to keep moving forward. And so, I see the practice as just a continual, and that the stroke of insight is just that the awareness that's recognizing the committee.
Yeah, I mean,
there's a committee. Oh, there is a committee.
Isn't it funny? We tend to think of ourselves when we feel or conceptualize ourselves as though we're one unified individual being, and yet we don't have to look that far to realize that's not so. We've all lain awake at night with conflicting voices going on our head. Should I leave Fred? Should I not leave Fred? Should I leave Fred? He's the only one who understands me. I have to leave him. He's abusive, but he understands me, but I love him, but he's a junkie. But, that's just commonly about love. We'll have conflicting ideas, right? But this goes for many other things, our profession, our education. If we really look inside, is there just one central voice? No, there isn't. That's another way into the direct experience of no self. It's like, okay, no wonder it's so confusing in here. I've got this multitude of selves. It's not just, there's not just one of them,
Well, I remember watching The Emperor's New Groove with my kids, and Crumb, who was, supposed to be the bad guy, but, the witch would give him a direction to go like poison, somebody, and then all of a sudden he'd have like the angel on one shoulder telling him what to, and then the devil on the other side.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the way it's in cartoons, isn't it? We know that. Yeah.
Well, it's a really brilliant Disney movie to watch. So if you haven't watched
we laugh at it because we recognize it, don't we? Yeah.
Yeah. And there's something you said about inquiry, like I just wanted to get that phrase from you that you were.
Yeah. One of the things behind koan study, although it's not in any way bound to koan study, is that we have to wonder about these things. It's not just a matter of, I know we're out of time, but just to say, the part that gets missing from Zen practice is we know we have to sit Zazen, which to some degree means letting go of thought, sitting in emptiness as best we can. We know we have to hear Dharma talks. So we need some instruction or reading. But the in-between thing that in my experience is what makes it all really percolate and turn into a coherent stew is we have to wonder and contemplate it in between times, So I hope we'll go away and wonder and think over some of this stuff. And then when we go back to our Zazen, we're like, we might come in with a question like, is it true there's all these different voices? Well, let me see if I can catch some of the voices that come up while I'm trying to empty my mind. There's going to be voices that come up while I'm trying to focus on my breath. Let's see if we can catch, are they all in agreement? That's just an example. Is there, can you go back into your practice and then investigate some of it? Can you see, after I read that Annie Dillard chapter, I had the same experience she describes in the chapter, which is when she heard about this research, she saw the world as a collection of color patches for weeks thereafter. And it had the same effect on me. It's though I could, can you suck the depth off the world now and see if you could see it as you would fresh? It's possible. You might be able to do it. Anyway, we have to end. Perhaps we can have another conversation about this. I want to add something to my bio, which is I run an organization called the Sage Institute, and we will be, it's Sagetaos.com if you want to look it up, or look Sage Institute of Taos. I'll be doing a 4-week class on the 5 conditions, that model of self-story versus direct experience of reality, and we have 4 weeks to work it through. And we also do a meditation leader program to help people who aren't going to jump through all the hoops to become a spiritual teacher, but might want to share basic meditation skills like a basic yoga teacher does out of their own experience, and learn some techniques for that. So anyway, if you're interested in more of what we do, you can just check it out, our website, Sage Taos. And what a pleasure to be with this community. I love connecting with you all.
Thank you so much.
We'll sort it all out. Next time we'll just sort out the whole business of the self, and then we can move on.
All right. Thank you so much.